at the old growth v austerity debate in Europe, where the balance of power is perhaps shifting. First of all, lots of bad news going around Europe, a presidential election in France, and some words over the weekend by the German Chancellor saying that perhaps there can be a little bit more ways to instill more growth in the EU. This coming also on the heels of last week of the president of the ECB calling for growth to be higher up on the agenda. A couple of your reactions on Facebook. Moretzi in the Botswanan capital says the tables are indeed turning around, while Ted thinks this may work out for Europe. Few doubt, I think, that some austerity was needed. Now, wisely placed stimulus is needed. It is a hedged bet, he says. When will that political will come to the U.S.? Mark Dean, an allusion to the fact that in the United States, it's still spend in his view. When you compare fiscal discipline on both sides of the Atlantic, how does Europe stand?
Well, I mean, the difference is quite shocking, of course, but the difference is that in the end of the day, the U.S. has the world's reserve currency. It has a united tax base, and I think the U.S. has real problems that it has to resolve in the medium term, and hopefully it will. But the situations aren't exactly the same. The European situation is about an internal balance of payments crisis, and I don't want to get too technical, but that's where the internal politics plays itself out, and the extent to which Germany is willing to refinance other countries becomes an issue.
Harold Howe, just a question for you here. If there was this push at the level of the European Central Bank to put growth on par with inflation, how would the Germans react? Because isn't there a legal issue with the German constitution putting in stone the fact that the fight against inflation must be first?
Well, that's separate from the issue of the policy of the central bank. Certainly the federal government has this sort of obligation to adhere to these relatively strict budget deficits. Therefore, it's very hard to imagine sort of an all-out sort of growth pact that would compromise these constitutional limits. So that's just beyond imagination in Germany.
So how do you imagine in that context the first sit-down between a President Hollande and Angela Merkel?
I think that the real constraining factor for Holland will not be Merkel. It will be the financial market and refinancing costs. I think that's, and possibly capital flight that we see now in Spain, where the banks have to be refinanced. And so I think the market discipline will probably do much more to any sort of very expansionary program that lacks fiscal discipline than Merkel or the fiscal compound.
But the program of Hollande is not lacking fiscal deficit. Like the reduction of deficit he wants is exactly the same than the one of Sarkozy. And is respecting the European agreement is exactly the same. But what he wants, not at the French level, but at the European level, is the growth investment.
So there are also commitments about retirement, taking back retirement reform and things like this.
How many people? Do you know how many people this will concern in France? It's just for people that begins to work very soon. That had more than 42 years of cotization. Everybody was too afraid. The entire world. I was back in the US last week. And people were like, oh, what will happen in France? You will have the retirement age at 60. But we need to explain people, it's just for the people that have more than 24.5 years of cotization. This is just a way to be fair and not to have people working for 50 years.
Even Sarkozy's reform on retirement won't suffice. So will Holland be able to surpass this politically? I think there's so many uphill battles ahead that the political left will find very hard to
Let's talk seriously, like looking at the number for 1 second. Look at what is the retirement situation in Germany compared to what it is in France. Like the French reform is pushing forward than the German one. We are doing to do much more. Because in Germany, they have just one parameter. In France, we have two parameters, the age, retirement age, and the less of cotization. So people are
number of years worked.
Yes, but people are playing on these two parameters too afraid French and too afraid the markets.
Right,
but in fact, we are doing better if you think that it is better to work more in terms of retirement than Germany. And this
All
is
right,
in the
let's
data.
just getting back to the point here. The incumbent and the socialist challenger, both of them are pretty close on the issue of more growth and as a remit for the European Central Bank. Nicolas Sarkozy, who insists he remains firmly pro-Europe, firmly in favor of a single currency. He does, though, as was done at the outset, as was brought up at the outset by Marina Yannakoudakis, he does acknowledge the 18% of citizens who voted for the anti-Brussels far-right National Front in the first round. Here's what Nicolas Sarkozy said Saturday at a rally in the central Auvergne region.
Europe today is seen as a threat. Do you think we'll be able to bear more examples like Greece? Make the people of Europe suffer even more? Do you think there are any farmers in Auvergne who think it is normal that we oppress them with norms, rules and obligations, and that we continue to import into Europe products from countries that do not respect any rules, norms or obligations?
Harold Howe mentioned in part one of our discussion the vast amounts of money spent on the common agricultural policy, but a statement like the one we just heard from Nicolas Sarkozy, is that something that reassures, scares, or leaves markets indifferent?
I don't think Nicolas Sarkozy is really reassuring anyone, particularly these days. And, you know, this sort of more nationalist bent that he's taken in, you know, the dying weeks of this election campaign is very unsettling for investors and outside observers. And in that sense, I don't think that, you know, you can necessarily assume that, you know, the sort of, again, the sort of debate that's gone on between Paris and Berlin in the past 2 weeks means that, you know, presumably if Hollande gets in next week, that he'll necessarily have a bad reception in Berlin. But you know, the conversation when it goes behind closed doors is going to take a rather different turn than it has been taking publicly.
Marina Yannakoudakis, you were quite clear in part one that you don't like the common currency. What scares you more, having a single currency or having perhaps too much power in one of the foreign capitals? In this instance, many economists think there's too much power in Berlin.
Well, I've always been concerned by the Franco-German relationship. We're talking about Europe. We're talking about a Europe where we're a friendly club. We'd like a Europe where we trade together and we work on areas of common interest. I am concerned about the Franco-German dominance of this club. I would like to see them being more equal club members. Am I worried about... I'm obviously worried if the euro does not succeed, how it's going to affect the UK and how it's going to affect the whole of Europe, actually. But I think really what we need to remember is that we're talking about 27 member states who are at different stages of their economy and their growth is different. And I think the previous speakers were speaking about pensions. And again, they're all at different stages. So how are you going to unify it all and get it all running together at the same time without causing more problems? I'm not really convinced yet. All
right. And well, let's pick up with a concrete example of a nation whose economy is not at the same level as that of France, the UK, and Germany at this point, and that's Spain. The crisis has been brutal all around for incumbents. In Spain, with the socialists gone, the new conservative-led government facing mass protests over the weekend against austerity.
It's clear that we're suffering a setback of more than 30 years. The situation is disturbing, but more disturbing is the situation that our children could inherit.
They are destroying the small welfare state that we had in Spain, and the only thing that they are prompting is more disadvantaged people in society.
Now, over the weekend, the Prime Minister explaining it's all in the interest of bringing down the deficit to 5.3% of GDP from 8.5% in 2011.
That's why we had to raise some taxes, and I know it wasn't part of our election manifesto. We'll try not to do these things in the future, but we had no choice.
Try not to do it again. That's tough for a politician, having to explain why he's just raised taxes. Harold Howe, is it untenable when you look at the situation of Spain? Can the euro still be held together?
I think a lot will depend also on the willingness of the government to pursue a sort of reform, and whether they at the same time willing to convince the financial market that the banking system will be restructured, that the fundamentals will be improved there. I think that is very, very important. However, if we get into a situation where we have mass capital flight, where people withdraw their money from Spanish bank accounts, and these deposits have to be replaced by gigantic liquidity injections from Frankfurt, and I think then we get quickly into a situation where it could unravel, and where we will lose a couple of members in the Euro club. That's sort of the alternative scenario. So I think it's at a fork where both things could happen. So I would predict there's a good chance that in the next 3 years we lose 1 or 2 Euro members.
Mark Dean, there's Madrid newspaper El País reporting that there's already money being put aside in a kitty to bolster the Spanish.
Well, that's why the European stability mechanism has been set up. That's why the IMF funding is there. That's why, the ECB has injected €1 trillion into the economy in the past 4 months. The money is there. But I think that, the European authorities all around hope that Spain doesn't have to seek a bailout, including the French authorities, because that will also increase France's national debt. And, that's
and Germany's.
And Germany's, yeah.
And on Thursday, I believe, there's a bond auction in Spain. How's that going to go?
Well, I mean, these bond auctions, I actually follow week after week, and sometimes they go better and sometimes they go worse. I mean, I think, I can't tell you how it's going to go on Thursday. The point is that the Spanish government continues to be able to refinance itself in the markets for now.
For now, Harold Howe's talking about 2 or 3 years down the road. You're looking to next Thursday. In between the two, there's 6 months from now. What will Europe look like? Well, the Dutch, the guardians of fiscal orthodoxy at times, seeing the far right's Geert Wilders triggering the collapse of the government, the sticking point, a belt-tightening budget, fresh elections slated there for September, as noted by the Financial Times of Wolfgang Munchau. He says Mr. Wilders, who had previously focused on immigration, has now adopted the Eurozone as his favorite subject, through which to bash foreigners. The rise of political extremism in Europe is in part the consequence of stubbornness and stupidity among centrist elites. It is a bit risky to judge someone before he's even elected, but I suspect Monsieur Hollande is the beginning of a progressive insurrection. What's your reaction when you hear that statement, that there has to be some sort of fight back, if the only ones against austerity, it seems, are the extremes?
It reminds me of the French situation in 1981, and there are a lot of similarities when Mitterrand opted for Europe and threw away his socialist program, and there's a good chance for this to happen again, I think. And don't forget, Hollande has an economic degree. He's sort of maybe politically, sort of in terms of economic policy, maybe not that further left than Sarkozy. So that's aside from his party, but I could imagine a European turn in his policy, I think.
Julia Cagé?
I don't agree that only the far right is against austerity. That's not true. Like, the left is against austerity, and a lot of people from the right even now are for austerity. Like, this is a very important point. If you look at Germany, and there is from times to times, not a lot, some German surveys in which you ask German people, do you want more austerity or do you want some growth in Europe? Obviously, they don't want to pay for all the European debt. They didn't want to pay for Greece and these kind of things. But if you look not only at German politicians, and if you look at German people, even now under Merkel government, they want more growth. Because what they know is that if all the Europe enter in crisis, much more than now, for example, if France is going to enter in recession, then Germany is going to suffer a lot. And one of the simple reasons why it will be the case is that France is the main German trading partners. So obviously, there is two things at the same time, and which make life complicated, even for politicians, is that people are afraid by the debt, and this is completely new. And I think this was not the case in 1981. People was not afraid by such a high level of debt. And right now, if you go even to coffee to talk with normal people, they are like, perhaps we are not going to be able to pay our debt anymore, and we are going to suffer. And
so
to look
that's
like
high on
Greece.
people's minds.
But
I just want to ask on this point, Marina Yannakoudakis, before we go, it's not just France holding elections. There's a general election in Greece coming up, and there the far right and far left are polling very strongly. What can be done to counter that for those who are pro-European?
Pro-Europe. Well, I think it's time that for Greece, I personally think they have to revisit the whole euro question. But how they deal with this, I don't know. But when we talk about growth and we talk about Holland, the socialists in the socialist candidate going for growth as part of his agenda, I think he's going to be challenged in reality when he starts putting the taxes up. So he's going to have other problems, and it's quite exciting for us in the UK because we're looking forward to welcoming all these people, these French who, if he does get through, who will be suddenly taxed at very high rates of 75%, I was told. So we have to see. As for the Greek election, they're struggling between one party and another, between extremes, because they have nowhere to go. The austerity packages is crippling. It's crippling the Greek people, and they need to look at another way of dealing with it.
All right, final word on this.
I'd like to keep them in Europe, though, obviously.
I'm very sorry, but French people are not going to flight to the UK due to increase in tax by François Hollande. And if you look at what Nicolas Sarkozy did, the famous bouclier fiscal, it didn't bring back anybody to France. And for the same reason, people are not going to leave France because of a small increase in tax rates.
All right, Julia Cagé, with the
final
word. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Marina Yannakoudakis, I want to thank you for joining us from London. I want to thank Harold Howe and Julia Cagé and Mark Dean. Thank you for being with us in the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Coming up next, it's time for business. Matthew Warren will tell all.